All right, namaste. I'd like to welcome you all to this episode of the Dharma Warrior podcast. I am here once more with my great friend, Dr. Christie Smirl, and we're here today for the latest installment in our Yoga Life Transformation Beyond Fitness series. And today's topic will be the power of pranayama. So how are you doing today, Christie?
Excellent. Thank you for having me on again.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you for being here. And so how would you like to start this off today? We're going to be talking about the power of pranayama. Pranayama is one of the 8 limbs of yoga. And for anyone who's not familiar, I guess maybe I could refer you to the very first episode of the Dharma Warrior podcast, where Christy and I discussed the 8 limbs of yoga at some length. And so I'll put a link to that in the description for anyone that would like to go back and get a better understanding of the 8 limbs of yoga, of which pranayama is only one. And pranayama focuses on breathing or breath work primarily. And so what would you like to say to start this conversation off, Christy?
Well, the first thing that I would want to start off by discussing is, what is pranayama? What's the word pranayama mean, or the general term? So we know that prana is our life force or our chi, and that yama is extension or control. Some depends on the definition and how you're breaking the word up. But when we look at pranayama, it's really important for us to understand that it is actually a technology that we can use to modify not only the way our physiological bodies are operating, but how our emotions are manifesting, or how we can curb our emotions and get better control over our emotions through pranayama. So like you said, pranayama is the 4th of the 8 limbs in the 8 limbs of yoga. And just from a medical standpoint, it has been absolutely invaluable to a lot of my patients at the hospital. And I think that it's often an underrated practice. So I'd love to discuss pranayama today, the benefits of pranayama, as well as some of the risks of pranayama. And I'd also like to go into the scientific basis of how that works, and then share a couple different pranayamas for people who are maybe a little bit new to pranayama, or people who just want some set practices that they can do each day.
All right, perfect. Yeah, that sounds great. So I guess starting off, we can, sort of just go over the general practice of pranayama and its overall health benefits.
That's a really important thing to discuss. The average human takes about 15 breaths per minute, and the average human only breathes involuntarily. So there's, 2 different types of breathing. There's metabolic breathing, and then there is behavioral breathing, or pranayama, which is consciously manipulating the way that the breath is ingoing and outgoing. So we know that metabolic breathing is just this involuntary process that occurs. We go to sleep, we don't have to think about breathing. And it's based off of the CO2 level and the oxygen levels within the body, as well as our metabolic demand. Whereas behavioral breathing is choosing a very specific pranayama method to manipulate the way the body's physiology and the way the brain is functioning. So, for instance, a lot of times when people undergo stress, trauma, different types of things in life, whether it was acute or it was long-term and chronic, we develop certain types of breathing patterns. Let's say you have somebody who's been in combat war, and they've developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and they have formed a type of hypervigilance as a result of that kind of on edge anxiety and hypervigilance. That comes with a very specific breathing pattern that they oftentimes don't realize that they're doing, even in normal conditions like washing the dishes. And the reason why recognizing different breath patterns is important is so that we can recognize when we're doing it. So I'll illustrate a few that are a little bit exaggeratory. It's not quite a word, but anyways, you know what I mean. So for instance, if you think about how people breathe when they're angry, we think of like a charging bull. They tend to, give this exaggerated, forced exhale. Now, a lot of people conceal that, but if you observe somebody who's kind of chronically on edge and cranky and angry, you'll see that they breathe in a very specific way. Whereas if somebody is anxious and stressed all the time, how do people breathe when they're anxious? Let's say somebody's having a full-blown panic attack. They tend to hyperventilate, short, shallow, quick breaths, kind of. Well, people, when the acute situation is over, tend to kind of tone that down. But if you watch somebody who is chronically anxious, even low-grade anxious, they breathe very differently, as opposed to, let's say, somebody who is chronically depressed and sad. They tend to breathe more like Eeyore, from Winnie the Pooh, and they'll, oh, and I'll sometimes say, what are you sad about? And they'll say, I'm not sad. I'll say, well, you breathe like you're sad. So the first thing is to recognize, how do we breathe on a regular basis? And then to begin adopting an actual method of pranayama, whether it's taking 2 minutes of awareness of your breath each hour, or doing 15 minutes pranayama practice in the morning and the evening, to begin breaking up the neural connections, the physiological connections, and emotional connections. So, for instance, we understand that based on how we feel, what our typical emotions are. Let's say we wake up in the morning, what are our average emotions? Are we stressed first thing in the morning? Oh my gosh, I'm going to be late, turn off the alarm. We start rushing around. That comes with a very specific breath rhythm. Even though it's involuntary, it is still there based off the emotion. And the thing that's important to realize about that is that breath pattern sends a very distinct signal to the reptilian brain, the deep brain stem. And it tells the brain stem something is wrong based off the way the person is breathing, whether it's an actual threat or just a perceived threat. And yogis have known the importance of breath manipulation for centuries, for thousands and thousands of years. So when we realize the science behind how it works, it makes a lot more sense. So I'll try to make it kind of brief and get down to the nitty-gritty of it. So we have two main mechanisms within our central nervous system. We have our parasympathetic nervous system and we have our sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system has sympathy for us, basically. So when we are under stress or fear, let's say anxiety, or under a threat, our brain and our breathing, the way we breathe, the way we think and feel sends a direct signal to the deep brain, the limbic system, and says, there's a threat out here. Whether it is actual or just perceived in the itty-bitty committee of the brain. Based off of the way the person is feeling and breathing, the sympathetic nervous system will say, okay, something's wrong. We either need to fight or flee, the fight-flight reaction. And when that occurs, whether it's acute, I don't know, a bear is chasing me, or just some made up nonsense in between my ears, I'm thinking anxiously, it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system to start excreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. We know these are powerful vasoconstrictors. So the blood vessels in the body begin to constrict, blood pressure goes up, respiratory rate goes up, heart rate goes up. The blood then shunts from the digestive system and moves out into the musculoskeletal system. So you can either fight or run, right? Well, the problem is a lot of people breathe and think in a low-grade, chronic, anxious, or hypervigilant manner, short, shallow, and faster. And so this is always happening on a low-grade chronic basis, not to mention the fact that the cortisol levels go up and that starts causing inflammation, all sorts of other problems. Now, when we practice very specific pranayama methods, we are most of the time, not always, some pranayama methods are different, but most of the pranayama methods are aimed at toning down, turning down, deactivating the sympathetic nervous system and dropping us into the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is associated with breathe and feed, or rest and digest. And so when we have this happen, we start secreting endorphins, the feel-good chemicals within our body. Our blood pressure normalizes, our heart rate normalizes, our breath rate normalizes, our digestion normalizes, which is very crucial, very crucial. And we're able to have proper rejuvenation, and we're able to produce more ojas through our system when we're in that parasympathetic response system instead of sympathetic nervous system. So when we look at pranayama, it's important to understand why we pick which pranayama method. And usually the ones that I recommend people practice on a regular basis are alternate nostril breathing and ujjayi breathing. And the reason why it needs to be done on a regular basis, at least a few times a week, is, all right, let's say we have something big happens. I don't know, somebody cuts you off on the freeways, flipping you off and threatening you, whatever is going on. And your heart starts beating, your blood pressure goes up, and you start, having that sympathetic reaction. That breath technique needs to be second nature, just to kick in immediately. And when we know about the breath technique, but we never practice it, it's like getting a membership to the gym, but never going. It needs to be second nature to people. So when we look at pranayama, we want to decide what pranayama method is most beneficial for that person, because some pranayama methods are actually dangerous. So let's say, somebody who is hot and overheated goes to Kundalini yoga practice and they're doing breath of fire all class long. That could actually trigger a lot more heat within the body. It can cause the blood pressure to go up. It can also cause stroke, seizure, and death. So pranayama needs to be practiced very carefully and appropriately.
Yeah, you hear all kinds of sort of horror stories about Kundalini gone wrong and things like that. And I guess that might be a subject for another day, but or I guess this also might be a good opportunity to mention that the last time that we got together was to discuss your Kundalini and Chakra workbook when we did our last installment, which was Unlocking Higher Life. So yeah, people could check that out as well. And yeah, everything that you're saying resonates greatly with me, and I think that it's important to sort of outline these fundamental aspects of pranayama. for yoga practitioners, because it is something that I've found can greatly enhance my practice at times when I do take, which now is regularly, but I've noticed in the past that when it falls off, that I'll catch myself throughout the day and my breathing will go back to those anxious patterns almost, right? There were times in the past when I would catch myself, or even still, I will catch myself at times if I'm ruminating about something or if I'm anxious. I'll be like, "Well, I'm not even breathing right now." Like, and I notice that the more that I'm practicing pranayama, that I that I maintain that rhythmic breathing throughout the day more naturally, and that I catch myself in those rhythmic patterns. Like early on in my spiritual practice, or my yogic practice, when I first discovered pranayama, which I guess came through Aleister Crowley's book 4. Part 1 is all sort of basics of yoga. And I would, even when I was walking down the street, or particularly when I was walking down the street or walking to work and things, I would keep the rhythmic 4/4 breathing and try to do that as much as I could throughout the day while I was at work, and just any time that I had to focus. And I would notice how much I would bring that into the rest of my day, the more time that I did put into focusing on it. And now, some 15 years later, 20 years later almost, I guess, I still catch myself doing that when I get into a meditative mind state. My breathing automatically goes to that cyclical in and out kind of 4/4 times breath.
Yeah, that is so important. Particularly when you discuss doing it regularly. When I was first learning about Ayurvedic medicine, a lot of times the recommendation would be to do a set pranayama practice, 5 to 10 minutes, morning, midday, and evening, to really begin to solidify the practice. And like you said, it's important to catch and to become conscious of how you're breathing, and not just breathing based off of what's going on in between your ears in your mind, and not breathe just based off of metabolic demand. It can actually greatly increase the amount of prana available, not only in the physical body, but in the subtle body. And, when we see practices of pranayama, we want to be very diligent which type that we choose, whether it's for maybe a teenager who has test anxiety, that might be a different type of pranayama we teach them. Or if it's somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder, we're probably going to pick a different type of pranayama for that person. Or a combat person who has, PTSD, we're going to probably pick a different technique for that person. Or somebody who is practicing martial arts and wants to have that upper hand of controlling their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. In yogasana, typically you'll see, unless it's Kundalini class, you can see a lot of breath fire. But in other types of asana training, typically they'll do Ujjayi pranayama. And Ujjayi pranayama can pretty much be used by anybody across the board throughout the entire day, and you could barely tell that the person is doing it. It's one of the most frequent ones that I use. And then we also have Nadi Shodhana, which is excellent for people who just kind of need to be talked off the ledge of anxiety or hypervigilance, or they need to really hunker down and switch, whether they're in the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, so that they can handle maybe a big presentation or handle a big public speech and things like that. So I'd love to go over those two today. But, I do want people to know there's a lot of different types of breath techniques out there. There's Kapalabhati, which is the shining skull technique. And that is excellent for retraining the neural connections and emotion and the nervous system. There's different techniques. Two of them are called Shitali and Shikari, where you breathe either through the tongue or through the teeth, and that's a cooling breath. Of course, we mentioned breath of fire. That's a heating breath, and it's not appropriate for everybody by far. There are different techniques. One's called Bastrika, which is a warming breath, and it's very specific. Like in Ayurveda, we prescribe it for people who have deep-seated anger and deep-seated sadness. And then different breath techniques are for, stimulating the digestive system, the Agni within the Jatar Agni, or also stimulating the metabolism in the body and stimulating the Saptadhatu Agni, digestive and transformative powers of the 7 tissues of the body. Because we understand that if we affect the Agni of the digestive system and we affect the Agni of the 7 tissue layers, that's eventually going to translate into the mind channels and start purifying the mind channels and then outward into the subtle body as well. So should we teach those two? Ujjayi and alternate nostril?
Yeah, that sounds great to me. Did you want to start out with Ujjayi breath or?
Yeah, I think Ujjayi is one of the most universal breaths. So, I always say when you start off a pranayama practice, the most important thing, never create air hunger. So some people, you'll say take an inhale to the count of 8 and an exhale to the count of 16, and they want to do it exactly like teachers doing it. And then they start creating air hunger. It's too long of an inhale or too long of an exhale. And that's never to be done, because then that triggers the sympathetic nervous system because your body thinks you're starving for air. So make sure whatever breath technique you ever choose, that it's comfortable and that it feels good. It should be, when we study Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, when he talks about asana, it's stiram asanam sukham. So stiram is steady, asanam, the pose, and sukham should be pleasurable. Same thing with breath and pranayama techniques. It should be steady, easy, but enjoyable. Or as I prefer to say, the breath should be delicious. If it's stressful, something's wrong. So Ujjayi, the word Ujjayi actually means victorious. And this breath enables us to be victorious over not only our emotions, but our body. So the nervous system, whether we're in the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. And like I said, it's one of the most common ones used in asana series, and even some martial arts teach it or a version of it, and they call it something a little bit different. So the first thing that's important to understand in both of the breath techniques we're going to learn today is the concept of basic abdominal breathing. So a lot of times when people breathe, they tend to hold their gut in. We kind of come from a culture that says you suck your gut in. And when we suck our gut in, or we are always, tucking our tummy in, it doesn't allow the diaphragm to drop down so that the lungs can expand fully. So in basic abdominal breathing, we want to take a full deep inhale and relax the stomach muscles. We're not puffing them out. We're not pushing them out. We're just relaxing the stomach muscles so the lungs can extend and expand fully. And then on exhale, it's very important in basic abdominal breathing, which is used in both breath techniques, that when we exhale, we activate the core muscles and they move inward and upward. So let's just work on the inhale for a moment. So those of you who are listening to this video, I want you to test how much air you inhale in. So just take a big, giant, deep breath in. See if you can do a little bit more. And then relax. Now I want you to tighten your gut, like you're trying to zip up your tightest pair of pants. So tuck your belly in, like you're tightening up your stomach muscles and you're trying to zip up your tightest pair of pants. All right. And take a big, giant, deep breath in. Now relax your belly. I got a lot more in when I relaxed my belly. Now, same thing on the exhale. See how big of an exhale you can do. Most people barely reach full inhalation, and most people barely reach full exhalation. We are going to try with comfort, with sukham and ease, to make sure each of our breaths are full inhale without air hunger and full exhale. So you have to relax the belly on the inhale so the diaphragm can drop down, lungs can expand. And on exhale, bring the stomach muscles in and up to push the diaphragm, give it assistance so that the lungs can. So that's the first thing to understand. Now, ujjayi is special. So ujjayi pranayama is always going to be inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose. We're not going to breathe through our mouth at all, unless your nose is totally stuffed up and you're just going to have to sit this out. So there's a special mechanism in ujjayi breathing where we activate or cause a constriction in the glottis of the throat. So the glottis of the throat, when we constrict it or activate it in a certain way, it causes what people will often call the seashell sound. And sometimes when I'm teaching this at the university, it's too subtle of a technique to learn at first. So what I recommend doing at first is breathe like Darth Vader. Pretend you're Darth Vader right now. I'll do it, you can do it. So how does Darth Vader sound? Right? Like that's really exaggerated glottis activation. Now, close your mouth and tone that down like 100 points and just hear that sound in the back of your throat. See if you can still hear that sound with your mouth shut. You've ever seen a little kid fake being asleep? Sometimes you'll hear them make that fake deep sleep sound, and that's what ujjayi should sound like. But it should be very, very subtle. Now, the reason why this is done, this is actually a technique that we often teach people with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because it constricts the airway just subtly so that there's back pressure in the base alveoli and the alveoli open up more. And it makes it so the breath takes longer to go out and in. So we're going to keep that activation the entire time. Now, depending on your lineage, depending on your teacher, you're going to have different breath counts. But for today, what we're going to practice doing, we'll do inhale to the count of 4, exhale to the count of 8. If that feels totally comfortable, you can transition to inhale to the count of 6, exhale to the count of 12. And if that feels comfortable, you can join me in inhale to the count of 8, exhale to the count of 16. That would drop us down to about 2 breaths per minute. But if you feel hungry for air, go back to the previous easier counting. So let's try it. First thing that we have to do when we do pranayama, we have to sit up tall. There's no laying down. There's no hunching over. Sit up nice and tall. Open up your lungs. Shoulders down, shoulders back. Open up the chest, right? So find that ujjayi sound, that seashell sound, or that teeny weeny Darth Vader sound with your mouth shut. You should be able to hear your breath. I don't know if you can hear my breath with it. It's very subtle. So remember, on the inhale, relax your belly. And on the exhale, activate your core muscles in and up to facilitate a full exhale. So we'll do just a few minutes of it. So we'll begin by inhaling to the count of 4. Exhale to the count of 8. Double the exhale. Inhale to the count of 4. Out to the count of 8. Now, most people can handle that unless they chronically take little tiny baby breaths. So if that's difficult, just practice that. But let's increase it to a more standard 6 and 12. So inhale to the count of 6. Out to 12. Into 6. Inhale all the way. Exhale to 12. All the way exhale, all the way inhale. Try that count one more time. Into 6. Out to 12. Now the trick is that the breath is smooth and relaxed. At that count of 6, you have to bring all the air in, fill the lungs completely. And the exhale is slow and controlled, slow and controlled. Otherwise, you run out of breath. Now, if that was comfortable, stay there. But typically, we will progress forward within, most people can handle within a week or 2 to move up to inhale to the count of 8, exhale to the count of 16. And that's actually dropping our breaths per minute down to about 2 breaths per minute. So if you get air hunger, just breathe on your own, but we'll do a couple rounds. So inhale to the count of 8, inhale all the way. Out to 16, slow. One more time, into 8. Out to 16. Now, if the person can reach that level, that's about all that I recommend that people go to an Ujjayi. And then let's say we're at the grocery store and somebody cuts us off with a grocery cart and you're thinking, right? Your heart starts going fast, you clench your fists up and you start breathing like an angry bull. That's the moment that you engage Ujjayi immediately. Okay. You immediately begin to breathe differently to deactivate that sympathetic reaction. Or let's say you are about to have a conversation with somebody and you know that they're going to be up in your grill and they're going to say nasty things, or you're about to engage in, let's say, a combat competition of some sort, martial arts. You want to do this breath technique first begin doing maybe 5 minutes of it. Tell your sympathetic nervous system to settle on down, go into your parasympathetic nervous system so that you have better control over your response rather than fight, flight, reaction. So I recommend that people practice this technique if it's comfortable for them, minimum 5 minutes 3 times a day. And that begins to reprogram the mind. That begins to get you thinking, oh, how am I breathing today? I was breathing like that earlier today. I felt really calm. As well as Ujjayi is commonly used to initiate and start going into meditation. So I know that you've done a lot of yoga teacher training as well. Have they given some emphasis on pranayama or this particular breath technique?
Yeah, absolutely. Ujjayi breath is, I guess, sort of one of the more common ones that people will come across, even just in more modern day yoga classes. And yeah, it is definitely something that was stressed in my teaching, and it is really good for people to actually just take a few minutes and sit down and do the practices, right? Because it's something that you have to feel, like, even when you practice it regularly. Like, I meditate every morning and I practice rhythmic breathing the entire time. And so I'm very used to that daily, but even still, when I sit down right now and I followed along with you, I can still feel it totally resetting the nervous system, even throughout the day. Just little stresses that accumulated, me wrestling with Zoom and technology and things like that, right? But even just in the 5 minutes or so that we just did there, it instantly reminds the nervous system, right, I can dial it back just a notch, right? Even, or as you were saying, with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, I know I've talked about this with you in the past, but ad nauseum, but I've had a lot of chronic pain in the past, and also at the time before my pancreas stopped making insulin, I was in an incredible state of stress, and it's humans have become great at stressing, or once we enter that fight or flight state, we tend to dwell on things, and it keeps us in that that fight or flight state. I forget exactly where it was. If I can find the exact TED Talk, I'll put a link to it. But I know there was a TED Talk just about about stress, and they told a story, basically, or they put it in the terms that when a mouse is threatened by a cat and running away, it engages the sympathetic nervous system, and it starts producing epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, and all of these stress hormones to get out of the fight or flight situation. But then once it finds a safe place and it's away from the cat, it stops producing those stress hormones almost instantly. However, humans, we have this way of creating a situation in our mind that our reptilian brain, as you were saying, interprets as a legitimate life or death threat in reality, because our brains just have this incredible power to imagine, but the simpler aspects of our brains can't necessarily differentiate between when we are imagining some perceived horrific threat and when that is actually a thing. so we tend to stay in that fight or flight state much longer than necessary, and it has a real toll, can really take a toll on the body and mind.
Yeah, it really does. You know, it causes chronic inflammation eventually. We know that a lot of the major diseases are caused by chronic inflammation. And, you know, people will, let me plug my mic back in. You know, I'll talk to different clients or patients and I'll say, oh, you know, well, you know, we have to worry about chronic stress and stuff. And they'll say, oh, yeah, you know, I deal with it. I'm good at it. And I'll say, well, what would you rate your stress level on a day-to-day basis? 0 to 10, 0 being absolutely none, and 10 the worst of your life. On a day-to-day basis, where would you say your stress level falls? And many of my clients will say, oh, I'm usually around a 4 to 6 stress level. I have a stressful job, etc. Sometimes it peaks to an 8 and it comes back down. And I'll say, is there ever a point in your day where you're like a 2 or below? And it's only a small portion of their day where they actually feel stress-free. And I'll tell them that entire time, your sympathetic nervous system is having sympathy for you and causing a whole cascade, just a crap storm of chemicals within your body. So it's really important for people to recognize it. And when you were talking earlier, you reminded me of it's almost like a quickening of the feedback system. The more often we practice pranayama, the quicker we respond to it. So let's say our next breathing technique, we're going to go over Nadi Shodhana. Let's say I do Nadi Shodhana practice once a month. It's going to take my body a lot longer to respond to that technique. Whereas if I do it a few times a week, or let's say twice every single day, sometimes just bringing my hand up to my face for the hand mudra, I'm like, I can feel my whole body just immediately begin to respond. It's like a trained reaction. So it's very important. The more often it's practiced, the quicker the benefit. And that's really, you know, beneficial to people who have high stress jobs, high stress lives, or who need to respond quickly instead of reacting.
Right. And because I think a lot of people experience that from the flip side of the coin, where they've developed unconsciously these ways that their body and mind reacts to things that happen throughout their day, but they don't take the time to consciously develop a way that they're going to react to those stresses and everything. So the body just immediately goes back to that breathing like a bull or whatever, right? And it's interesting that like that bull breath is like an immediate sort of like just taking in a huge amount of oxygen. It's almost like preparing itself for this like adrenaline blast or something, right? Or it's like or it has like this I'm trying to find a way of saying that initial breath in almost causes a stress in the body itself.
Yeah. I remind people all the time. I say, if you want, you can trick your body into an anxiety attack. Just breathe like you're anxious. Everything could be totally normal. I'll say, breathe like you're anxious for 5 minutes and see how crappy you feel. Or I'll say, just spend the next 5 minutes breathing like you're pissed off or depressed and see what happens. You'll have an entire body response to that breath method. So it's just so important, and very underestimated and underutilized. I've been trying to teach, you know, people these breath techniques for well over 15 years. And it's amazing how even clients at the hospital, let's say they're in chronic pain and they're on, you know, chronic use of narcotics, just by doing 2 minutes of a set pranayama prior to a pill, I'll say, okay, document on your pain log, what's your current pain level? They'll say, okay, 6 out of 10. So I'm going to take a Norco. I'll say, well, can you try doing your alternate nostril breathing for 3 minutes first and then re-rate your pain scale? And the majority of the time, unless they're just a chronic drug abuser, which is, a different subject, the majority of the time, the pain scale will come down and maybe they can just pick a Tylenol instead of a Norco or a narcotic. So it's very important. Same thing with people who take anti-anxiety medication. Let's say they take as needed PRN, Ativan, or Xanax. I'll say, okay, so your next dose is a 0.5 as needed tablet. Tell me what your anxiety scale is, 0 to 10. And they're like, 8 out of 10. I need my Xanax. Okay, cool. Why don't you try 5 minutes of Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, and then re-rate your anxiety scale for me. And maybe you only need half that dose afterwards. And without fail, unless they're just a straight out drug addict, without fail, they will usually report a lower scale of whatever was troubling them, the use of lesser medication, or just skipping it altogether. I'm going to be doing a podcast out in the Los Angeles area in a couple of days on integrative medicine. And this is one of the big things, traditional medicine, Western medicine, they don't teach these techniques. They don't have the education. They don't have the practice themselves to teach patients this. And it's a very important subject. So, okay, I'll get off my soapbox. But the other breath technique that I wanted to cover today is Nadi Shodhana. So Nadi Shodhana, Nadi is the Sanskrit word for channel, basically. And nadis are considered part of the subtle body. So we understand that we've got 3 big nadis. We actually have 72,000 nadis that all begin to coalesce, and they go into the central channel called the Sushumna that goes up and down the spine. And we have 2 big ones that crisscross. It looks just like the medical caduceus, but we don't learn it in medical school. Go figure that. Anyways, so it crisscrosses, and one is the Ida and one is the Pingala. Well, when we do this breath technique, Nadi Shodhana, Shodhana means to cleanse. We're cleansing our major channels, the right and left side of the subtle body, the solar channel, the Pingala, and the lunar channel, the Ida. And we're purifying them or balancing them and stabilizing them so that more prana goes to the central channel, your Sushumna channel, which is considered your spiritual channel or your soul channel, so that the soul can be in the driver's seat instead of the itty bitty shitty committee going on in your brain. Excuse my language. So Nadi Shodhana technique, when we're doing it, we're actually balancing the Rajas and Tamas associated with the Ida and the Pingala. We are helping to balance the solar energy and lunar balance in our bodies, as well as our subtle bodies, as well as their correlation to the right and left sides of the hemispheres of the brain. And when we're balancing the right and left side of the brain, the 2 hemispheres, we have this ability to harness higher levels of creativity, inspiration, insight, psychic abilities, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. I put most of them in the article that you've already posted. So how does Nadi Shodhana work? First thing we have to do, and this is appropriate breath technique for pretty much anybody, unless one or both nostrils are occluded. So if you close your right nostril with your thumb and you can't breathe in and out of your left, you have to skip this technique. If you close your left nostril with your ring finger and you can't breathe out of the right side, then you can't do this technique. And sometimes the nostrils are occluded because maybe, there's a deviated septum from a broken nose, or maybe a polyp or a cyst, or just too much mucus and congestion in the sinuses. And if that's the case, then just go back to Ujjayi breathing. Okay. So in this particular breath technique, we actually use the specific mudra, and I discuss it in the article that Dharma Warriors already posted. But we use our thumb and our ring finger. And I won't go into all of the energetic physics of why, because certain fingers do certain things and have certain energies associated with them. So we use our thumb and our ring finger. And these two fingers are either tucked down, depends on your lineage, or placed at the third eye. I prefer to tuck them down personally. So just begin by going back and remembering basic abdominal breathing. You got to relax the belly when you inhale so the lungs can expand all the way, because we're going to take big, long, deep, delicious breaths in and out. We're going to do it for the same count also. We're going to do 6 in, 12 out. Now there's different counting techniques. There's different rhythms. There's breath holding, breath retention. We're not going to go over that today because some people get a little too crazy with it and then they get air hunger. So we're going to do the same count. Into 4, out to 8, into 6, out to 12, into 8, out to 16. But we're going to alternate. So the technique is you close the right nostril, you inhale in to the count of, let's say, 4. And you switch out to 8. Into 4. Switch out to 8. Now, if that's comfortable, you can progress to 6 and 12. So in to 6. Switch out to 12. Slow. Into 6. All the way. Switch out to 12. Slow. So you get the rhythm. Now that breath technique is phenomenal also for people with anxiety, insomnia, general agitation of the mind. It's excellent for pain reduction, and it's phenomenal for focusing the mind. It's one of the primary breath techniques that many lineages use before going into meditation, because we already know that pranayama is the 4th limb of yoga. And then after that, we're looking at concentration, withdrawal of the senses, concentration, and then moving into meditation and samadhi. So it is extremely difficult, if not almost impossible, to go into deep states of meditation if your sympathetic nervous system is agitated. And some people will sit and they're like, okay, I'm going to meditate. Oh, yeah. And I can't because my brain is going too fast. I'm too distracted because they haven't shut off their sympathetic nervous system. They need to start off with maybe 5-10 minutes of pranayama. This is an excellent technique first, even 10 minutes before meditation. And then their meditation will be much more effective. So I hope that helps people. And I hope that you practice. I know that you'll include a couple links. I think I only have a link to the alternate nostril breathing. But is there anything else you want to discuss or add?
No, I think we can just conspire after this, and we can maybe add a couple of links that I'll put in the description, just in case you had any other videos or anything that you wanted to share that you thought would be beneficial to people who are starting out or looking for more information on pranayama or breath techniques. Yeah, it's been a really great discussion. And the exercises, I feel, are great for anybody who, whether you're coming to the subject as a beginner or intermediate or I myself, I do have a slightly deviated septum. I've had my nose broken a handful of times, and I also get seasonal allergies. So this morning, when I woke up, I was like, "Oh God, I might be that person who doesn't have blow through the right nostril." But then, as the day carried on, it got a little better. But it's when the combination of the two come at me, right? Like it's like I definitely get a little less air through the right nostril. I noticed that it mostly affects me on the intake of air through the right nostril. It's and I've noticed that throughout the recent pandemic, where I've had to wear a mask, that I noticed only one of my glasses will get fogged up when the nostril is kind of restricted. And yeah, it just sort of pointed out to me that it is a little worse than I give credit. I should almost consider having the surgery or something to that effect.
That's an important thing to recognize before doing alternate nostril breathing, because it can cause air hunger through the one side. And I recently got over a pretty bad cold. I rarely get sick, but I had a really aggressive head cold. And I had to resort to some more regular practices that people discuss in the Yogic Shakriyas, the 7 cleansing actions, and go back to doing nasal cleansing with a neti pot. And then in Ayurveda, they also recommend doing anutailam. So you buy a very specific nose oil, and then you put the oil up in your sinuses and do these different techniques, and it purifies the head neck region. It's called the Shivovirechana karma. And a lot of times, even with the deviated septum, that's enough to clear out that congestion. And I know that quite a few of my yoga students who are doing yoga teacher training with me during the pandemic, wearing a mask all the time, they had more sinus issues, kind of like stuffiness. And the anutailam and or neti pot practices helped them pretty considerably. Yeah, but that would be a whole nother discussion.
That's something that I'd never heard of personally, but now I'm thinking about, or I have thought about it in the past, when I noticed that I get less air through the right nostril. It's like, so that's supposed to be affecting the left side of the brain, or the Ida Nadi, or perhaps, or maybe can I was thinking that it might explain some of the aspects of my neurosis or something to that. Actually, is all I was getting at.
Yeah, the way we breathe really does affect the way we feel. And the way we feel directly affects the way we breathe. And that is a immediate correlation to the nervous system and the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, and, the Agni that is moving through the body and how it's moving and how the Vayus are functioning. And, then we could go into all the details of how that's affecting the chakras, etc. But, most important thing, I tell people, breathe yourself into a better mood. Literally, breathe yourself into a better mood. You feel depressed? Well, stop breathing like you're depressed, first of all. And pick a different mood to vibrate. We're responsible for the mood that we have. And, I get into bad moods all the time. I get into sad moods. I get into agitated moods. But when it's really, really important, I attempt to watch my breathing very closely. If I have to have a harsh interaction with somebody, I'll say to myself, watch the way you're breathing. Watch the way you're breathing. Don't hold your breath. Don't start huffing like a bull. And it really helps, because the minute you lose track of that, you'll feel the heart get high, heart rate speeds up, face will start to flush, your breathing changes, your pupils start giving away your emotions. So it's a life skill. It's a life hack, actually. So anyways, thank you so much for having me on Dharma Warrior again.
No, thank you for being here. The pleasure is always mine. And today was great. And for anyone who hasn't had the opportunity, go over to dharmawarrior.net and have a look at the article that we've just recently presented there, called The Power of Pranayama by my good friend Christie Smirl here. And unless there's anything else that you wanted to add, I guess we'll just close on that note, and we'll see you all again in the next episode. And thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom and your light once more with all of our friends and followers. I think that people are really going to love this episode and be able to benefit from it. So
wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you very soon.
Okay. Yeah. Namaste.
Bye. Namaste.